Have you ever trusted someone blindly and then suddenly seen that trust betrayed in a devastating way? Imagine what it's like to have your best friends, the ones you trusted most, turn against you. What would you do if, instead of support, what you received was a profound betrayal? This story is about Caitlin, a young woman who believed she had loyal friends by her side, but ended up being stabbed in the back by them. What she didn't expect was that this betrayal would be just the beginning of a journey of overcoming, full of twists and turns that would change her life forever. When we think about friendship, we think about support, about being there for each other in good times and bad. But what happens when those who should support you are the first to bring you down? Caitlin experienced this drama firsthand, and what seemed like the end for her actually turned into a new beginning full of inspiration. This is a story about learning to trust again, about reconnecting with yourself, and most of all, about finding strength even in the worst betrayals. Get ready for a journey of overcoming and exciting twists and turns. If you're already curious about what's to come, subscribe to the channel right now and don't miss any inspiring stories like this. Turn on notifications to receive first-hand updates next videos, and closely follow these incredible life lessons that can transform the way you see the world. Join us and always be up to date with new episodes that will motivate you to overcome any challenge. Caitlin, a talented and determined girl, was preparing for the most important editions of her school life. The annual theater play was a golden opportunity to showcase your talent and, of course, win the lead role. However, what should have been a moment of inspiration and excitement soon turned into an experience marked by pressure and expectations. Her friends, Regina and another colleague, with their dismissive attitudes, began to undermine Caitlin's confidence, saying phrases like, "You deserve the lead role. We don't even want it." Deep down, Caitlin knew this was just the beginning of a drama involving envy and competition, but she couldn't help but feel touched by the apparent admiration. What they said was a mix of sarcasm and false humility. Caitlin, with her sensitive soul, felt a responsibility to live up to the expectations that everyone seemed to have of her. The idea of standing out in an environment that often seemed more cruel than welcoming began to weigh on his shoulders. Overcoming this internal dilemma would be the first step towards facing the real difficulties that were to come. After all, it wasn't just about being good enough, but about keeping her self-esteem intact in the face of the constant twists and turns that school life had in store for her. When the play's director announced that the lead role was up for grabs, Caitlin felt her heart skip a beat. It was his chance to shine, but at the same time, immense pressure began to build. Her friends' words, although they didn't seem cruel on the surface, fueled an internal doubt. Am I really good enough for this? This question, which resonated in his mind, brought with it a feeling of insecurity. The altruism that Caitlin carried in her heart, always seeking to please and not create conflict, made the pressure even more difficult to bear. She wanted the role, but not at the cost of hurting or disappointing those around her. The school, as much as it was a space for learning and growth, was also the stage for countless dramas. And Caitlin knew that behind her friend's sweet words was an unspoken competition. Regina, in particular, seemed to harbor a hidden ambition. While he pretended not to want the lead role, his eyes always lit up when the possibility of being the center of attention arose. The tension between the three was palpable, and Caitlin, in her humility, tried to maintain balance. But the truth is that she was about to face a much bigger test than simple auditions for a school play. The theater has always been Caitlin's refuge. There, she could be whoever she wanted, explore her emotions and challenge her own limits. However, this passion was now overshadowed by the expectations of everyone around him. It was as if the weight of having to prove one's worth was greater than the pleasure of acting. Each rehearsal, each sentence rehearsed in front of the mirror, brought with it a mixture of inspiration and doubt. Overcoming this pressure would require more than talent. It would require courage. Caitlin would not only need to convince others that she was the best choice for the role, but also herself. With auditions approaching, Caitlin realized the competition went beyond theatrics. It was a psychological battle. Her friends, with their subtle comments and critical looks, made her constantly question her abilities. And what's worse, she knew that any mistake could be used against her. Am I exaggerating? She asked herself, but deep down, Caitlin knew something was wrong. The humility she had always tried to cultivate was being tested to the limit. She wanted to shine, but the fear of failure was always lurking, ready to sabotage her. On the day of the auditions, the pressure reached its peak. The stage, which was once their place of safety, now seemed like a trap where any false step could cost them everything. Caitlin, with sweaty hands and a racing heart, looked at her friends who, from afar, watched with enigmatic smiles. The feeling that something was about to go wrong came over her. However, Caitlin knew that, to overcome that pressure, she would need to find within herself the confidence that the words of others could not shake. It was the moment of truth. When it was her turn to take the stage, Caitlin took a deep breath. I knew this was the decisive moment. Her friends' voices still echoed in her mind, trying to destabilize her, but she focused on the only thing that could control her, her passion for art, the altruism that always guided her, of thinking about others before herself, was left aside for a moment. At that moment, it was about her, about your dedication, your overcoming and your ability to change the game. And with that, she took her first step onto the stage, ready to show the world what she could do. The public was attentive. All eyes were on Caitlin. And suddenly, what was pressure began to transform into energy. Caitlin felt the power of the stage, the power to express herself and free herself from all the doubts that haunted her. The drama, which had once seemed like a barrier, was now the driving force behind her performance. The turnaround was beginning to take shape. In that instant, Caitlin realized that the real competition was not with her friends, but with herself. It was about overcoming your own limitations, facing your fears and shining, regardless of other people's expectations. Immediately after the audition, Caitlin was full of hope. Her performance had been intense, and she felt like she was finally on the verge of achieving something she had always dreamed of. However, the feeling of triumph was soon crushed by a rumor that began to circulate through the school corridors. At first, she didn't believe it. She thought it might just be a misunderstanding. But as the days went by, it became clear that Regina was spreading rumors about her. The dismissive comments and sniggers began to erode Caitlin's confidence, creating a silent drama that she didn't know how to deal with. Regina, who had always shown herself to be a loyal friend, now revealed herself to be a dangerous opponent. The feeling of being betrayed by someone she trusted shook Caitlin to her core. She began to question herself. What did I do wrong? Why is she doing this to me? These questions consumed her. It wasn't just about the audition, but about what that betrayal meant for their friendship. Overcoming this feeling of betrayal seemed far away, especially when all she wanted was Regina's support, not her hurtful words. The turnaround in their friendship was a blow Caitlin was not prepared to face. The impact of Regina's words began to manifest itself more deeply in Caitlin's life. In the classroom, in the cafeteria, even during play rehearsals, Caitlin felt the stares and whispers around her. People commented, made jokes, and looked at her in a way that made her feel small, like she was always under judgment. Insecurity grew within her, and the confidence she once carried with so much pride began to dissipate. The drama of this betrayal led her to isolate herself, moving away from her friends, increasingly enveloped by doubt and fear of what could come next. Despite all the pain she was feeling, Caitlin still tried to maintain the appearance that everything was fine. The humility he always demonstrated became a kind of shield, a mask to hide his true pain. Deep down, she believed that she could overcome this alone, that she didn't need to expose her vulnerability. But as time passed, Regina's betrayal began to erode her defenses. Caitlin could no longer hide how hurt she was. And worst of all, she still harbored hope that Regina could, somehow, regret her actions and return to being the friend she always was. Overcoming betrayal, especially when it comes from someone so close, is an internal battle that is difficult to win. Caitlin knew that, in order to move forward, she would need to face this reality head-on. However, every time he tried to approach Regina to clarify things, she was met with dismissive looks and venomous comments. The pain of seeing their friendship disintegrate before their eyes was almost unbearable. And once again, Caitlin found herself immersed in a sea of insecurities. The confidence that once propelled her onto the stage now seemed a distant memory. Regina, on the other hand, seemed to have fun with the situation. For her, the turnaround in her friendship with Caitlin was not a source of guilt, but rather a certain perverse satisfaction. She fed on Caitlin's insecurities, playing with her emotions as if they were just a piece on a board. And that was what hurt Caitlin the most, knowing that the person she trusted was using her vulnerabilities against her. Regina's betrayal wasn't just a blow to their friendship. It was a cruel way of destroying Caitlin's self-esteem, something she didn't know if she could overcome on her own. The effect of this emotional drama soon began to show in other areas of Caitlin's life. His performance in rehearsals began to decline. The words that had previously flowed so naturally into his speeches now seemed heavy, as if each sentence were a burden to be carried. She felt constantly watched, judged, and this affected her ability to concentrate and perform well. The pressure to continue being the best was now mixed with the fear of failure. And deep down, Caitlin knew that this insecurity didn't come from her abilities, but from the betrayal that still echoed in her mind. The pain of betrayal brought to the surface doubts that Caitlin had never faced before. She always believed in the value of friendship, loyalty, and trust between people. But now, faced with Regina's attitude, she wondered if she had been naive. Was it always like this? She thought. The memories of the good times they spent together began to distort, and Caitlin could no longer distinguish what was true and what was just part of a facade built by Regina. The emotional upheaval she was experiencing left her paralyzed, not knowing how to deal with this new scenario in her life. Regina's betrayal also brought to light Caitlin's need to look within herself. She realized that although she was deeply hurt, she needed to find the strength to overcome this situation. The inspiration to move forward couldn't come from Regina or anyone else. It would have to come from within her. Caitlin began to understand that in order to free herself from this pain, she would need to regain her confidence and self-esteem. And this would only be possible if she put aside what others thought and focused on what really mattered: her passion for art and her personal journey of overcoming. Caitlin knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Overcoming Regina's betrayal and regaining her trust was an immense challenge, but she also knew that she couldn't allow this situation to define who she was. The turning point in her friendship with Regina was just one chapter in her story, and Caitlin was determined to write the next chapters based on the truth, humility, and strength she knew she had within herself. And so, she began to chart a new path, a path of overcoming, where the drama of betrayal would be just an obstacle to be left behind. As time passed, Caitlin began to sink into a state of doubt and isolation. Regina's betrayal affected her more deeply than she had initially realized. The world around him, which had once seemed full of color and possibility, was now dark and confusing. The mean words echoed in her mind, and the feeling of being constantly judged took over her routine. She began to withdraw from people, including those who truly cared about her. The drama unfolding in his life was no longer just external. Now, it lived in his mind, and the turnaround was about to begin. It was in this scenario of emotional fragility that Caitlin began to hear voices, as if someone was trying to speak directly to her deepest fears. Alia's figure, initially just a nebulous presence, soon became something more palpable. Alia was like a distorted reflection of reality, encouraging Caitlin to doubt everyone around her. "They are against you," the voice said, feeding his insecurities. And Caitlin, already emotionally exhausted, began to believe. Overcoming this state of doubt seemed increasingly distant, as if I were trapped in a maze with no way out. Conversations with Alia intensified. At first, Caitlin believed these interactions were just figments of her imagination, perhaps a defense mechanism against loneliness. But over time, Alia began to occupy a larger space in his mind. She seemed to understand Caitlin in a way no one else could. When the real world became unbearable, Alia was there, offering a kind of twisted comfort. The drama had now become an internal struggle, where Caitlin no longer knew who to trust, nor whether she should trust herself. The turnaround was about to take on proportions she never imagined. With Alia by her side, Caitlin began to isolate herself even more. What was once an attempt to avoid the judgment of others now turned into a complete escape from reality. The voices of her friends and family became distant noises, while Alia's words sounded clearer and clearer. Caitlin began to wonder if she could ever truly trust anyone. With each new piece of advice Alia gave, the more Caitlin distanced herself from the people who cared most about her. Overcoming this isolation seemed like an impossible mission, and Caitlin, lost in her own thoughts, began to sink into an emotional abyss. The inspiration Caitlin used to find in art and theater has also disappeared. She, who had always found refuge on stage, now felt that that safe space was also compromised. The lines that previously flowed naturally were now interrupted by the doubts that Alia planted in her mind. "They're laughing at you," the voice whispered, and Caitlin could no longer discern what was real from what was a creation of her own insecurity. Art, which had always been her escape, was now a distant memory of a time when she still believed in herself. The drama she lived internally made any attempt to overcome it impossible for Caitlin. Caitlin's isolation intensified every day. She avoided her friends, alienated her family, and deep down she believed she was doing what was best for herself. Alia's constant presence gave him a feeling of control, as if, by listening to this figure, she was protecting his heart from the hurts that the outside world could cause. However, this false sense of security was eating away at his mind. Caitlin didn't realize that by isolating herself more and more, she was giving herself over to a cycle of self-sabotage. The altruism that had always defined his personality now seemed a distant quality, buried by doubts and the fear of trusting again. The internal upheaval that Caitlin experienced was a reflection of what was happening around her. She distanced herself from the people who wanted to help her, while growing closer to a figure that existed only in her mind. Alia, with her seemingly comforting words, encouraged Caitlin to cut ties with everyone. "They just want to hurt you," he said, and Caitlin, already fragile, believed. Isolation seemed to be the only solution, and overcoming this dark phase in his life seemed increasingly impossible. She couldn't see a way out, and the drama continued to intensify in her mind. As Caitlin moved away from her friends, they began to notice changes. Her absences from rehearsals, her increasingly withdrawn behavior, and her refusal to talk aroused the concern of those who really cared about her. But no matter how much they tried to get closer, Caitlin pushed them away with a coldness that wasn't like her. "You don't need them," Alia repeated, and Caitlin, suffocated by this new reality, no longer knew how to ask for help. Isolation, which once seemed like protection, now held her hostage. Overcoming this cycle seemed increasingly distant, but something inside her was still fighting, even if in a subtle way. Behind all this drama, there was a small flame of hope. Even though Caitlin was deeply wrapped up in her own doubts and the isolation that Alia encouraged, a part of her still longed to reconnect with reality. There were moments, brief and almost imperceptible, when Caitlin missed the life she had before all this started. She remembered how good it felt to trust people, feel the support of friends, and find inspiration in theater. But these moments were quickly drowned out by Alia's voice, which pulled her back into the darkness. The turnaround in her life was underway, but Caitlin still couldn't see the end of that tunnel. Caitlin's isolation and her increasing conversations with Alia began to take on an even greater proportion. She could no longer clearly distinguish what was real and what was a figment of her mind. The voices that had once seemed like just whispers were now screaming, and Alia's presence was everywhere, like a shadow that constantly followed her. Caitlin, who had already lost control of her social life, was now beginning to lose control of her own reality. The drama she was experiencing was no longer something external. It was a mental battle that was slowly consuming her, and she still didn't know what was happening to herself. Over time, Caitlin's hallucinations became more frequent and intense. Alia's figure not only spoke to her, but also manipulated her emotions, making Caitlin believe that everyone was against her. The internal struggle was exhausting, and Caitlin found herself trapped in a cycle of paranoia and mistrust. His behavior, once sweet and humble, was now marked by outbursts of anger and despair. She began to have difficulty concentrating in class, and even small daily tasks became almost impossible to accomplish. Overcoming this state seemed unattainable, and Caitlin was losing her identity in the midst of this whirlwind of emotions. Her mother, who had been watching the changes in Caitlin's behavior with growing concern, decided to intervene. She realized that this wasn't just an ordinary teen drama, but something much more serious. Caitlin, who used to be so dedicated and involved, was now just a shadow of her former self. Her grades began to plummet, her absences from play rehearsals increased, and, most worryingly, Caitlin completely withdrew from her friends and family. When her mother tried to talk, Caitlin pushed her away, saying she was tired or stressed. But the truth was that she no longer knew how to ask for help. The upheaval in her mental life was underway, and her mother knew something needed to be done. It was then that, after much insistence, her mother managed to convince her to seek professional help. Caitlin was reluctant at first, afraid of being judged or appearing weak. But deep down, she knew she needed help. The psychologist appointment was a pivotal moment in Caitlin's life. There, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a mental condition that affects the perception of reality, and which, in her case, was manifesting itself through the voices and hallucinations that Alia represented. The news came as a shock to both Caitlin and her mother, but at the same time, it was a relief to finally understand what was happening. Now, the real challenge of overcoming began. Caitlin found herself facing a new reality. The diagnosis brought with it a mixture of feelings: fear, relief, and deep uncertainty about the future. The drama that had played out in her mind for so long now had a name, and with that came the responsibilities and challenges of treatment. Her mother, always by her side, was a source of inspiration for Caitlin, showing her that, despite the difficulties, there was light at the end of the tunnel. Overcoming it wouldn't be easy, but Caitlin was no longer alone. With the support of her family and professionals, she began to embark on a path to recovery. Initial treatment involved both medication and therapy. Caitlin, who had previously felt completely lost, was now beginning to find small sparks of hope. Therapy sessions helped her better understand her condition, and medication began to alleviate the hallucinations. Little by little, Alia, who was once a constant presence, began to disappear from his mind. Caitlin still had a long way to go, but just starting to regain control over her life was a huge victory. Overcoming this chapter in her life was just beginning, but Caitlin felt that, with time, she could regain what she had lost. However, the hardest turnaround for Caitlin was not only dealing with the hallucinations, but also facing the stigma associated with her condition. Schizophrenia, like many other mental illnesses, still carries a social burden, and Caitlin feared judgment from her friends and colleagues. She wondered if anyone would treat her the same way again, if they would see her as crazy or different. The internal struggle against this fear was as challenging as the symptoms of the condition itself. But over time, Caitlin began to realize that overcoming it also involved accepting her condition and understanding that it didn't define who she was as a person. Your mother was a fundamental player in this phase of acceptance. With patience and care, she showed Caitlin that schizophrenia was just a part of her life, not the whole. She encouraged Caitlin to seek inspiration from people who also faced mental health challenges and found ways to live fully. Caitlin began to be inspired by overcoming stories of people who, like her, learned to live with their conditions and find strength in their vulnerability. Little by little, Caitlin began to regain the confidence she had lost, realizing that although the road was long, she was surrounded by support. Caitlin's journey was still far from over, but overcoming the first stages of her treatment was already a great victory. The drama that once consumed her was now giving way to a sense of hope and control. With proper treatment and her mother's support, Caitlin began to understand that the turnaround in her life was not the end, but the beginning of a new phase. She had a lot to learn about herself, about her strength and her ability to overcome challenges. Schizophrenia would be a part of his life, but it would not be its definition. Caitlin was ready to face whatever came next. After being diagnosed with schizophrenia, Caitlin had to face an even greater challenge, learning to live with her new reality. The treatment brought relief, but the voices and hallucinations still persisted at times, especially when she was alone. It was then that her mother, always attentive to her daughter's needs, made an important decision, adopting an emotional support dog. Scout, a small and intelligent therapy dog, was introduced into Caitlin's life as a way to help her distinguish reality from hallucinations and provide companionship in her most difficult times. For Caitlin, this was an unexpected but hopeful turn of events. Scout was not just a companion dog, but a true coping tool for Caitlin. Whenever she started to feel lost in her hallucinations, Scout was there, ready to remind her of what was real. The little dog had a special ability to sense when Caitlin was feeling anxious or insecure, and his simple presence was enough to bring a little peace in times of chaos. Caitlin soon began to realize that with Scout by her side, she didn't have to face everything alone. He became a constant source of inspiration, showing her that even on the hardest days, there was always a reason to keep fighting. Scout's presence brought a sense of security to Caitlin's life that she hadn't felt in a long time. Before, moments of solitude were the most terrifying, as that was when Alia, the hallucination, appeared most frequently. But now, with Scout by her side, Caitlin felt like she could handle these moments better. The dog, in a humble and silent way, showed her that reality could be comforting, even when her mind tried to convince her otherwise. Overcoming her fears and anxieties began to seem more possible, and Caitlin found a steadfast companion on her journey in Scout. The impact Scout had on Caitlin was immediate. It not only helped her emotionally, but also physically, reminding her to take care of herself and go about her daily routine. Caitlin, who previously had difficulty even getting out of bed on difficult days, now had an additional responsibility: taking care of Scout. This encouraged her to stay active, walk him, feed him, and dedicate part of her time to training the dog. Every small task he did with Scout brought a feeling of accomplishment and another step towards his recovery. His humility in recognizing that he needed help, and that this help could come in the form of a dog, was a key point in the turning point in his life. In addition to being a calming presence, Scout also helped Caitlin distinguish the real from the imaginary. One of Scout's main functions was to understand whether the voices Caitlin heard were real or hallucinations. He didn't react to sounds that Caitlin heard in her hallucinations, which served as a clear sign that those voices were not part of reality. This small detail, although simple, was a huge relief to Caitlin, who often found herself confused and disoriented. With Scout, she knew that whenever the dog didn't react, she could trust that what she was hearing or seeing wasn't real. This emotional and practical help was fundamental in overcoming it. Over time, Caitlin began to rebuild her life, and Scout was by her side every step of the way. The dog accompanied her in her therapy sessions, on walks outdoors, and even in school classes. He has become an essential part of her routine, and his presence has brought a new sense of normalcy to Caitlin's life. Overcoming daily challenges now seemed more possible, and Caitlin found strength not only in her family and friends, but also in Scout, who quietly and affectionately helped her face her fears with more confidence. The turnaround Scout brought to her life was proof that help could come in unexpected ways. The inspiration Caitlin found in Scout also spread to other areas of her life. She began to realize that, just as the dog helped her distinguish the real from the imaginary, she could also apply this principle to her relationships and emotions. Caitlin learned to be more honest with herself, acknowledge her feelings, and ask for help when needed. The altruism she had always shown for others was now being applied to herself. She began to take more care of her mental health, taking time to relax and find ways to connect with the present without letting hallucinations control her. With Scout by her side, Caitlin also began to reconnect with theater, something she had lost during her battle with schizophrenia. Drama classes, once a source of anguish, were now an opportunity to express herself, and with Scout by her side, Caitlin felt like she could face anything. The drama that once seemed to suffocate her was now seen in a new light. The stage became a space for overcoming, where Caitlin could explore her emotions more safely. With each new day, Caitlin rediscovered her passion for art and life, and Scout was by her side every moment of her journey. Scout, with her quiet loyalty, helped Caitlin understand that the road to recovery didn't have to be lonely. The turnaround he brought to her life was not only practical, but also emotional. Caitlin began to feel more connected to the world around her, more confident in her decisions, and more capable of facing the challenges that arose. The little emotional support dog became her greatest ally, a source of strength and inspiration she never knew she needed, but now couldn't imagine living without. And so, with Scout by her side, Caitlin knew she could face the future with more courage and hope. Over time, Caitlin began to realize the impact her separation had had on her friends. During her darkest times, she had distanced herself from the people who truly cared about her, believing the lies her mind made her believe. Now, with Scout's support and the clarity the treatment provided, Caitlin knew it was time to mend the bridges she had burned. Her mental health drama had led to a turnaround in her relationships, but she felt the time had come to seek reconciliation. Overcoming this estrangement would be a crucial step in her recovery journey. Meeting her friends for the first time since her diagnosis, Caitlin was nervous. She knew she had a lot to explain, and the fear of being judged still hung over her head. When he approached them in the schoolyard, his friends looked surprised. It was as if Caitlin, once so isolated, was returning to the confident, kind girl they knew. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but filled with humility. And then, with a heavy heart, Caitlin began to tell everything she had been through in the last few months. The hallucinations, the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and, most of all, how sorry she was about being away. Her friends, who had previously been confused by Caitlin's distant behavior, listened intently. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't understand the depth of the situation. When Caitlin revealed her condition, their reaction was one of empathy and support, not judgment. "We never stop worrying about you," one of his friends said. The emotional upheaval Caitlin feared didn't happen. On the contrary, it was received with understanding. That conversation, which Caitlin feared so much, ended up being one of the most important of her life. It was the beginning of overcoming his isolation and reestablishing ties that had been broken. For Caitlin, that reconciliation was a moment of great relief. She realized that, despite the difficulties, her friends were willing to forgive her and support her in the new phase of her life. The inspiration she found in that moment helped her realize that she didn't need to face her condition alone. Her friends offered to learn more about schizophrenia in order to better understand what she was going through. Caitlin was touched by their selflessness, and that attitude further solidified their bond. It was as if, despite all the drama, the time apart had never really destroyed the friendship. Caitlin's friends began to become actively involved in her recovery. They encouraged her to continue participating in play rehearsals, helped her with her schoolwork, and, most importantly, made a point of being by her side whenever she needed to talk. Caitlin's humility in admitting her struggles and asking for forgiveness created a new dynamic in her friendships. The supportive and caring environment that his friends created around him was fundamental to his recovery. Little by little, Caitlin began to trust people again, knowing that despite the challenges of her condition, she had a solid, loving circle of support. With this reconciliation, Caitlin also began to feel more comfortable talking about her condition with other people. The stigma she feared so much now seemed less scary. Thanks to the support of her friends, they made her feel safe to be who she really was, without fear of judgment. Overcoming her insecurities and fears did not happen overnight, but was an ongoing process. Every little gesture from her friends, a word of encouragement, an invitation to go out, or even a simple smile, helped Caitlin reconnect with reality and understand that she wasn't alone on this journey. The turnaround in his social life was marked by moments of affection and learning. Her friends, now aware of her condition, treated her with the same respect and affection as before, but with a deeper understanding of her needs. Caitlin, in turn, felt more inspired to be open about her feelings and emotions. She realized that the true value of friendship was in the ability to overcome difficult times together. The drama that once seemed insurmountable was now seen from a new perspective, as a phase of growth and learning for both her and her friends. Caitlin also began to reciprocate the support she received. She realized that just as her friends were there for her, she could be there for them too. The humility with which they treated her inspired her to be an even more empathetic person and attentive to the needs of others. Caitlin became more involved in school activities, helping other students who were experiencing difficulties whether emotional or academic. She saw that overcoming her own challenges not only made her stronger, but also better able to help others. The turnaround in his life brought not only healing, but also a new purpose. With Scout always by her side, Caitlin also felt more confident facing the world. The dog, which was now part of her daily routine, was a constant reminder that, despite all the difficulties, she could count on the unconditional support of her friends and family. Reconciling with his friends was a milestone in his recovery, but it was also the beginning of a new phase in his life, a time when Caitlin knew that no matter what challenges her condition brought, she had people by her side who loved and supported her unconditionally. Caitlin could now look to the future with more hope. Overcoming the challenges that schizophrenia brought was still a daily battle, but she knew she didn't have to fight alone. Reconciling with his friends showed that even in his darkest moments, there was light waiting. And with the support of those who loved her, Caitlin was determined to continue her journey, knowing that each day brought a new opportunity to grow and strengthen the connections that, in some ways, had always been there. With all the pieces falling back into place, Caitlin began to envision a new chapter in her life. The drama that had consumed his last few months was now turning into inspiration to move forward with more determination. She knew that although her mental health condition was a constant challenge, it wasn't something that would define her forever. The real turning point in her life was realizing that with the right support and love from her family and friends, she could build a future full of new possibilities. It was a new beginning, where overcoming became the key to facing any obstacle that appeared. His relationship with Scout, his emotional support dog, grew even stronger. He was not only a comforting presence, but a constant reminder that Caitlin had a purpose. Taking care of Scout made her feel responsible and capable. It helped her stay connected to reality, and that connection was vital to her recovery. Every time she went for a walk with him, Caitlin felt a renewal of energy. The humility he always carried with him was now transformed into a quiet strength, something that gave him stability in the most difficult moments. She knew that despite the challenges, she was on the right path. In addition to Scout's support, Caitlin began to reconnect with her passions, particularly theater. Going on stage again was a real turning point in his life. In the first rehearsals, she felt a slight fear, as if at any moment she could lose control. But contrary to what she feared, Caitlin found in theater a new way to express herself and process her emotions. The stage, which was previously a place of insecurity, now became a space for overcoming. Art gave her a voice, allowing her to channel all of her experiences in a way that made sense to her and others. Friendship with Regina and the other girls also took a new direction. Caitlin realized that even after the betrayal and hardships she went through, there was room for forgiveness and reconciliation. Although her relationship with Regina would never be the same, Caitlin found peace in letting go of the past. The humility with which she faced these upheavals made her stronger and more resilient. She now knew that she didn't need everyone on her side, but she deeply valued those who remained faithful and loyal. The lesson he learned from all this was clear. True overcoming is not just overcoming external challenges, but in forgiving and moving on. At school, Caitlin also began to excel again. Her grades improved, and her confidence in classes and schoolwork returned with a vengeance. But now, she didn't see academic success just as a goal, but as part of a larger balance that included taking care of her mental health. The inspiration that Scout and her friends provided gave her the motivation to keep pushing herself, without losing sight of what really mattered. Caitlin learned that her journey was unique, and that no matter the obstacles, she could always count on the support of those who loved her. The new phase of Caitlin's life also brought a change in how she saw the world around her. Before, school and social relationships were seen as a constant battle, where every mistake could be used against her. But now, Caitlin viewed these interactions more lightly. She realized that she didn't always have to be perfect, that it was okay to make mistakes, and most of all, that vulnerability wasn't a sign of weakness. This change in perspective gave her more inner peace, and made her realize that overcoming it also involved accepting who she was, with all her challenges and imperfections. The relationship with his mother, who had always been a pillar in his life, became even stronger. Caitlin recognized how much her mother had sacrificed to help her get through the worst of times, and now she wanted to return that love with more presence and gratitude. The two spent more time together, talking about the future and celebrating small daily victories. Caitlin knew that her mother was an endless source of inspiration, and that family connection was one of the biggest forces driving her forward. It was a new beginning, where love and humility reigned, creating a solid foundation for everything that would come ahead. As she progressed on her recovery journey, Caitlin also began to become more involved with support groups at school, helping other students facing emotional and mental health difficulties. She became an active voice in raising awareness about schizophrenia, sharing her story of overcoming with other young people who, like her, needed inspiration to keep fighting. This new role in the school community was, for Caitlin, a real turning point. From a girl who isolated herself and feared the judgment of others, she now became a leader who used her experience to support others. Over time, Caitlin began to see that the new beginning she longed for was not a point of arrival, but an ongoing process. Every day, she was faced with challenges, but now she had the tools to face them. Overcoming was present in every small victory, from getting out of bed on a difficult day to going on stage and shining in yet another performance. Support from Scout, her family, and her friends was the foundation of her recovery, and Caitlin knew that with this support network, she could face whatever twists and turns life threw at her. The future was now open, full of new possibilities. Now, after following Caitlin's journey, it's impossible not to wonder, how would you deal with such a profound betrayal? How many times do we trust the wrong people and end up getting hurt? But the most important question is, are you willing to stand up, reconnect with who you really are, and overcome these challenges? Caitlin showed us that, even in the darkest situations, it is possible to find a way back. You just need to have support and believe in your own strength. And you, are you ready to turn obstacles into stepping stones to a new beginning? Remember, true overcoming begins when you decide that betrayal or any other challenge will not define you. Caitlin turned things around, and you can too. So, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning and being inspired by stories like this. Don't let difficulty stop you. Use them to grow. What will you do today to change your future?